developed by Jews mainly, right? Not the case anymore, but essentially developed by Jews. You know, our Jewish wisdom over the years is quite amazing. After Rabbi Evan decided to become a rabbi, and my wife had wanted me to go to Torah study for a long time, and I refused, but I didn't want to be a stupid father of a rabbi, right? To embarrass him in public. So we started to go to Torah study, and in the Torah, the families and individuals are just like the patients I saw in my practice, for better or worse.
Yeah, that's actually that. This is a true story just about that, and then we'll get to the next question. And I told this, I was teaching this class. I'm finishing up the class right now at Flagler College that I was doing on sabbatical. But about 10, 12 years ago, I was invited to teach a class at Wheaton College. So, Wheaton, of course, here in Chicago, which is like the Harvard of evangelical. It's very, very fundamentalist, but they're not. I mean, the professors are top notch. I mean, the professors go to top notch schools. So it was an interesting. So it's just a one session where I was doing something about the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and I was talking about the biblical characters of Jacob and Moses, and I was saying somewhat critical things about, I was saying that, Jacob, he has 12 kids and he's not the best father. He kind of gives one special gifts and, ignores the other. And I could see their mouths drop on the students. I mean, it's a smaller group as I was telling them this because now over time, during the rest of the class, they understood and it was very meaningful. But I think the idea of critiquing biblical figures is especially if you're just studying the New Testament, is not something that's done in a scholarly setting. But in Judaism, that's been part of our tradition, part of Midrash, has always been, ups and downs and careful analysis and taking, we don't have the idea of sainthood. We sort of accept all the figures of Torah with their flaws. That's almost a very different topic. We can come to Torah study if you want to explore that more. Yes.
So I'm going to start with the questions, and this is really for, you can always chime in, but Dr. Steve, you've written about the innovative Free Spirit nonprofit treatment program emerging from the trauma of the Nova Musical Festival massacre on October 7th. What can the field of psychiatry learn from Israel's hard-won expertise in treating war trauma, and how can it be applied globally?
Yeah, that's a sad, it's a sad, unfortunate development that Israel has and Jews over history have had to learn so much about recovering from trauma, right? I mean, we've gone through so much of it during history, and Israel's been a leader in lots of things, but I think it's forgotten that we are leaders in psychological development as far as trauma goes because we've experienced it so much. And they have some innovative treatments there, like one of the psychotherapies addresses PTSD just like we do in the United States, but adds a focus onto what's happening in your real life, kind of doing both at once. They use hyperbaric oxygen a lot there. Unfortunately, the clinicians have been hit with the same trauma as the population. So it's like overwhelming these last couple of years to try to address all the psychological needs there. But I think, any country could learn from how Israel addresses trauma. And the goal of trauma, and again, this is something you don't really want to have to do, is to get better. But getting better even more so than you were beforehand. So that's called post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic strength. And how is that done? I mean, you'll see how well this fits into congregations and Judaism. Number one, you have to ventilate about what you've been through with the trauma to somebody, a loved one, rabbi, someone. You need to ventilate and talk about it. Secondly, you need the support of your community, like the synagogue. And the third is you have to look at your vision differently because of what you've been through and hopefully learn from what happened. So the other thing, which isn't directly in this question, is what does Israel have to do now to look back on why the invasion occurred on October 7th? Because perhaps, and I would say likely, there was some contributions to that happening from Israel and the government and maybe the whole population. So, and that's why this vision has to be renewed to get past, the worst trauma. If you don't examine what has happened to you for trauma, it's dissociated often in your mind. You don't think about it, but it affects you anyways. And then there's triggers that bring out the trauma. So it could be very disruptive if you don't process it.
That's great, and I think so true. And I mean, I think in some ways that post-traumatic growth is essential. And I think many people in life experience it. I mean, trauma is kind of a vague word. What trauma means in one society is different. Okay, you fail a test, someone can process that as traumatic. You go through a suicide bombing. I mean, that's it's a different level, but we use the word trauma. But when you were speaking, I was thinking back. I was in Israel for my first year in Israel in 2001, 2002, and there were suicide bombings every week. In fact, they ended the year early, and there was a lot. We had a lot of discussions at that time about trauma. But what I noticed, and this could be wrong, and being a child of a psychiatrist, this might be heresy, but in some ways, there were some people, and this is not everybody, they have the ability to just go on. It's almost like you experience trauma, and somehow it's not like you ignore it, but you are just able to really focus on the present moment. Not everybody has that, and obviously it's not a binary, it's not A or B. There's a spectrum, but someone needs to be muted.
And she was dating another guy in the building.
Good for her.
So I think that is it. There's a spectrum, but certainly there are people who, and I think there are many Israelis who just simply by the nature of the society have that ability.
Yeah, you reminded me to add something. We're affected by the trauma that's happened in Israel, right? Probably all of us. Got these ripple effects out. As a psychiatrist, I developed my own secondary trauma because I treated so many people with severe trauma. But this rippling out of trauma, if it's not too bad and you're particularly strong, I think you could do exactly what Rabbi Evan said. But I think as a whole, we need to give congregants and anybody Jewish in the community the opportunity to process how they're feeling. So in a way, we're doing that now. We had at least 2 or 3 sessions in our synagogue in Milwaukee about how people were feeling about the trauma that occurred in Israel. What were their reactions? How did they cope? And I think that's really important too. We're not separated from Israel, although probably much less severely affected.
100% true. After October 7th, I had maybe half a dozen people, maybe even more, who came to talk with me about feeling, just really feeling vulnerable. And by the way, a lot of rabbis after what happened in Detroit. I'm on the rabbinic Facebook groups and listservs. There's a lot of rabbis that are just sort of terrified. So it is. On the other hand, also on the strength side, I talked about this during Rosh Hashanah this past year. We saw a nice surge in membership after October 7th of people who they're Jewish and they live in the area, but in some ways in Highland Park or Deerfield, it's easy to take Judaism for granted, and so you don't really have to belong to a synagogue even to feel Jewish. But the parents, again, I met with several parents who said, well, we want our children to know something about who they are and to feel some pride in it, given this world. So it can also create a certain sense of strength, which is, I guess, good, but also not something you want to aim for.
Mm-hmm.
You both work at the intersection of Jewish identity, trauma, and renewal. Where do you see the most promising signs of genuine healing and renewal in Israel and in the American Jewish community right now?
This is a tricky question. I think the Jewish community and organizations should keep doing whatever they've done over the years, right? Probably things would be a lot worse if all our organizations weren't doing what they've been doing. But it's not enough. I think we really have to think of new ways to address anti-Semitism that might be helpful. The main person that comes to mind right away to me for that is Dara Horn. She's the author of People Love Dead Jews, right? I don't know if people have heard of her, but she has a unique idea of what to do. Actually, after the book was published in 2022, people started to ask her, well, how do you reduce anti-Semitism? And she didn't have an answer, actually. And so she's worked on the answer since then. She's established an organization called TELL, but her idea is you have to emphasize curiosity. You have to teach people, both Jews and non-Jews, especially kids, the history of Jews and what we've done. And she posits that Jews are different because we've been counterculture all the way along, and we've opposed authoritarian governments. And that's something that hopefully is important for all people. So her next book is something like, what's the final solution for Jews? Now, she's a
He likes
master.
good titles. Sell books.
She or the publisher is a master of titles, right? And what she's talking about is a new solution. From my point of view as a psychiatrist, I think in what I tried to enhance in the book I edited on anti-Semitism and a pamphlet I did on it was, I think psychiatry has to study it, anti-Semitism and all these social psychopathologies, Islamophobia, sexism, racism, and so forth. I think psychiatry has to study them more. We've kind of put them to the side because we just focus on our individual patients. But I think we have ways to contribute to that and maybe do research. So I think my field has to do more. So I think new ideas and developments have to occur now. We just haven't been successful enough with traditional ones.
And I think that not only did we have a resurgence in membership, but in our learning. And I think all those things are so positive. People want to be a part of something larger. We belong to the Union for Reform Judaism. People come here. It's bigger than just lighting candles at home or doing Judaism at home. And I just think that's so important.
Just one thing to add about anti-Semitism is in many ways, and this is not original with me, this is what Jonathan Sachs said, is anti-Semitism really isn't a Jewish problem. It's a problem for other people. We can't solve it. I mean, you can research it, but it's something other people do. And in some ways, the strongest solution to anti-Semitism is a strong Jewish identity and stronger state of Israel. I mean, I think stronger Jewish community. I think that's how it's been for the last 100 some years. And yes, we can address it, but in many ways, Jonathan Sachs talked about it as a virus, and a virus mutates, and you don't know where if we could eliminate all viruses, we would, but it's impossible. So in some ways, anti-Semitism there's so many different explanations, but it's something in many ways so deeply rooted in some societies that it's very, very difficult to, even if you understand it, to eliminate it. Yeah.
Yeah, the paradox, I think, in that is when anti-Semitism rises, Jews come together more. And some who are uninvolved come together. Again, you don't want that to happen, but now's the time. So we need to make as good use of this concern of other people getting more involved and so forth.
As Jewish professionals, a psychiatrist and a clergy member, deeply engaged in Jewish life, how do you hold both your clinical neutrality and your personal anguish about Israel simultaneously? And do you have to? And what do you say to mental health professionals who are struggling with the same tension, or congregants struggling with the same tension?
Well, I can't speak to mental health professionals. I think, fortunately, I think that our community, we certainly have differences of opinion, but I have always felt that our I've been kind of lucky as a rabbi in that our community doesn't experience really deep divisions around Israel. There was an article in the New Yorker just a couple of weeks ago about how this one congregation, I think in Minneapolis, St. Paul, it was so divided that the rabbi just left. And I mean, it's just a horrific. And I think for a variety of different reasons, we've been able to do things. And my wife's synagogue, it's not the same. It is more tense. So that's one thing. The second way that I've certainly met with people that have different opinions, and I think you can't judge, and you always have to, unless otherwise indicated, assume good intent. Even if somebody, I mean, there are people that are anti-Zionists, and to me that view is an anathema. It's outside but if I'm meeting with someone who has that view, I'm going to assume good intent until expressed otherwise. So I think that is something, at least how I won't shy away from convictions, but at the same time, don't judge somebody even if what they're advocating is way outside of your convictions. It's hard. So it's not always easy. Yeah.
Yeah, very hard. This is going to be difficult for me to talk about, and my wife can supplement this perhaps later on. We share a computer, so she knows what comes into me. And some of the stuff from my colleagues, especially non-Jews, but also Jews, because Jews have different opinions, which is, I think, both a strength and a gigantic weakness also. So there's these discussions in these different listservs we have about what's going on in Iran, Israel, Gaza before that. Most of my Jewish colleagues have disappeared from that discussion. So I'm more or less left to deal with a bunch of psychiatrists of different faiths who think the whole problem is Israel, and Israel deserved invasion and so forth. And I think my usual neutrality as a psychiatrist disappears sometimes, but I have to keep it because it goes nowhere to get angry and critical about your opponents. It actually makes everything worse. So I have to deal with them with respect, curiosity, and so forth. And at least there's one place I know we succeeded, which is editing these 4 books on different religions and psychiatry, which has authors and editors of all the different faiths, Eastern religions, Christianity, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. So we've been able to get through those 4 books, and my being uncomfortable with some of the things that have been written in the Islamophobia book. Our second edition just came out.
You should explain, just so everyone understands, my dad helped edit this series of academic books about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and a few others. And he was able to get a kind of cross-section of different, credentialed, affiliated psychiatrists. And it was a political battle to get all of those people together. Very, very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah.
So people understand.
Yeah. Thank you, Rabbi. And in that regard, I should probably tell you what started this. I think I told Vanessa earlier, what's a nice Jewish boy psychiatrist doing editing a book on Islamophobia? So this came up about a decade ago. I somehow became the Jewish representative among psychiatrists when there were discussions like panels and symposium about interfaith issues and Islamophobia. So after this panel on Islamophobia, acquisition editor from Springer comes to me and says, do you want to write or edit a book? And I said, maybe, depends what you want. And eventually we got to her asking, how about doing a book on what you all just did on Islamophobia? And I said to myself, are you crazy? Yeah. The PR from a Jewish psychiatrist being the lead editor on a book of Islamophobia, we'll get creams. We'll just get cream. People won't even read the book. They'll just bash it. And then I thought, well, there must be some good reason she's asking. She knows I'm Jewish. And she said, well, you've edited books on all sorts of cultural stuff, so I know you know that. And you've successfully got books published, so you'll get the job done, I guess. And I thought, well, okay, I'll think about it. And what I thought was, well, maybe I can get co-editors from different religions. Getting my psychiatrist colleagues from Christian background was easy, but finding two Muslim psychiatrist co-editors was really hard. I found one of them just by noticing an article. This was a young British Muslim psychiatrist who since has called me his spiritual father, and he's come to Milwaukee. The second one, I wanted a female Muslim psychiatrist. Tried to contact her because she was recommended. She didn't respond. She finally did, and she said, "You shouldn't be editing this." And I said, "I don't want to. Do you want to? Do you know Muslim psychiatrists that will do this?" She said, "No." And we went back and forth. And finally she said, "If you give me a section of this first edition, I'll be part of the whole thing." I said, "Yes." We did the first one. We've gotten along really good ever since then. And the same thing has occurred with all the other books. It's like working through these differences, finding what we have in common, getting trust developed, and treating each other well. So
Thank you. That,
I have tons of other questions, but do we have questions? If you have a question, raise your hand and then you'll talk into the microphone. Come on,
we can.
here we go, Lynn.
I just have one question about, dealing with trauma. I was going to respond to you when you were talking about trauma. How do you feel about compartmentalizing as a coping mechanism when you're dealing with trauma? In other words, I had this in the past where I have a personal issue that's creating trauma, but then I needed to focus on what I was doing, and I had to compartmentalize, and eventually it worked itself out as a coping mechanism. So I don't know
Compartmentalizing.
if that's healthy or not. I mean,
well, good for you, actually. So she was asking about compartmentalizing after trauma, so they're trying to put the trauma somewhere in your brain. Sometimes it's conscious that it's there, sometimes it's unconscious. So if you can get by without having to deal with it, and there aren't triggers that makes it come out uncomfortably, and time, people say time's a healer sometimes, and it probably has been for you. So maybe you've had great support. I don't know if that's your husband next to you, but
Yeah.
he's,
Yeah.
but if you've had really good support from important people around you, that usually helps. So no, that's great. The only trouble with that is usually a person doesn't know whether they're going to be successful with putting it aside. So, but if you wait and you're not so much affected by it, terrific. Whoops, that'll listen.
Yeah, everyone's, I knew people.
So, good question. Trauma depends on how you're looking at it.
Mhm.
From our standpoint, we look at trauma as us being bound, having to go in shelters and being afraid of our safety. From their standpoint, they look at the trauma as being told that they were kicked out of their homeland, centuries ago, and we have no right to be there. And then you have, so they're reacting from what they see as a post-traumatic event from prior to 1948. We're looking at it from our perspective. And truly, if you look, what's crazy is that in the area where, October 7th occurred, they were getting along, there were two communities that were working with each other. But then you had other leaders taking advantage of other people's fears, finding factions that would, meet their goal, on both sides of the fence, and everything implodes. So how do you react? How do you put that together?
Thank you, Dr. Sifnik. It's a good question. I'll give a quick rabbinic answer before my dad does. The rabbinic answer is that was the plight of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's one wicked, awful leader can cause trauma to an entire population. And Pharaoh's, his hardening his heart kind of is the illustration that what we would say the extremists can do can create trauma and awfulness for everybody else. And that's and really the only way out is God, is the story of the Exodus. But it's a truism that it really isn't fair. Extremists can hijack a peace process easily.
Yeah, I think what the rabbi is talking about alludes to maybe the importance difference with leadership, which I think you mentioned too. So take Gaza or Iran, very strong authoritarian leaders who take advantage of people being afraid. And so the people, you almost establish a cult with your leader. And so people, they're afraid, they'll go along with anything, say in Gaza, because it's dangerous, both imagined and real. With Israel, it's again different because people disagree, and even if
There are some cults, though. There are some extremist cults, of course, on the extreme right.
Yeah, in Israel. Yeah, I was going to mention that too. But on the whole, you have very different opinions. And so I think that makes people somewhat less susceptible to severe trauma. What's important about Israel, I think, in contrast to Islam, please don't repeat this publicly, but Islam is a very authoritarian religion. You're not supposed to disagree with it. It's not like they have reform Islam. There's no such thing.
True.
You follow it or you don't. And so, but in Israel and for us, there's a moral aspect to all of this. And so if you end up feeling morally injured, whether you're a soldier or you're a citizen, that makes the trauma even more difficult to deal with. So I think it's different, and a lot depends on leadership.
It's great.
I think that the one word that, you'll realize, they can't hear, fine.
We'll repeat the question too.
I think that the word that encapsulates, what I've been watching about is denial. I just, the other night, watched the film Nuremberg. And. Nuremberg.
Mm.
Is it like that?
Doesn't seem.
In the film, which I guess was a repeat of what really happened in Nuremberg, an American psychiatrist was brought in to talk to horrible Nazis and basically to find out what made them tick. And the main one they were after was Herman Baron. And it was fascinating to see the process. And after the psychiatrist, after the trials were over, the psychiatrist wrote a book. And people started interviewing him and asking him what it was that made the Nazis different from all of the rest of us. And he said, they're not different.
That's true.
We're all alike, certainly. And he was, they stopped interviewing him. People stopped talking to him. His book never sold because nobody wanted to believe what he had to say in those days. So I guess my question is, how do you overcome that sense of denial when you see what's happening right in front of your eyes?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I don't think anybody wants to feel that they can do these horrible things and that everybody is capable of them. That makes it really hard to live every day. By the way, that psychiatrist got enamored with the high-level Nazis, which is, when you talk about your own reactions, that's a difficult negative one, that he got so enamored. I'd actually recommend Robert J. Lifton's The Nazi Doctors better. I'm probably saying that because he interviewed so many doctors in Germany, and they abandoned their morals essentially, because they were afraid, or they convinced themselves the Nazis were doing good things. So I think it's useful to try to accept that what we're capable of. Dara Horn, who I mentioned before, really hones in on that, that we have to realize our own vulnerabilities. But you have to do it gently and not so negatively to get past the denial and not wanting, to feel that you're capable of anything like this. None of us, I think, knows for sure what we would do in a similar circumstance, whether we were in Germany or now in Israel or a Gazan. I mean, you don't know how you're going to react under these circumstances. But the more you sense about what your own strengths and vulnerabilities are, the better for whatever comes up.
Agreed. We got a lot of questions. Yeah.
My kids live in Israel, and I am fascinated in a weird way how happy they are and how positive they are. And they're busy baking cookies. And my grandson is a Golani. And boy, I finally asked my daughter, is he going to summer camp? He's having a great time. And I'm thinking, oh my God, they went to the safe room 7 times last night. And they said we had a lot, together time. Now, I can't think of 3 Americans that would react like that. So what makes the difference?
Well, I'll give
Or is
you,
it the Pharaoh?
no, I'll give you I think Israel, in all studies of happiness and positivity in society, Israel is always near the top, just behind all the Nordic countries. It's always like Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Israel. It's interesting. And I think part of it is, it is a patriotic, tightly knit society in many ways. So there's a shared sense of purpose, at least among the Jewish community. And so that creates happiness. There's a sense of we're sacrificing ourselves for something larger. Your grandson, he's not going to summer camp, but at least, he's doing something that feels important. And so that brings happiness. And then, there is something, my dad can talk to this more, but trauma bonding. There is something, people can grow closer when you're dealing with a difficult circumstance. So, I mean, that's not the same as happiness, but there is something, as we've talked about, sometimes trauma can bring closer ties.
Yes, exactly. And I don't think that's denial, as we were just talking about. I think that's sort of the importance of the community and feeling connected to one another and having to rely on one another in such a small country. By the way, I have to say hello to my son-in-law. I don't know when Bill came in, Stacy's husband,
Yeah.
and my eldest grandson, Noah, who tends to ask the hardest questions. So I don't know, you can be quiet if you want, but so, but yeah, it's an amazing country. And overall, as Evan was saying, the mental health is really good there, other than whatever effect the trauma is having on people at certain times. Mental health is high.
Yeah, it's truly remarkable. Yeah.
All right, this might be kind of off the track a little bit, but I have a problem with the whole concept of trauma. Because what we're talking about is kind of trauma is more universal within our community or our extended community or our extended Jewish group, where it's shared, and it's almost like, I don't want to say an in thing, but you have to feel the trauma as opposed to somebody's personal trauma, which you're not as comfortable sharing with, they're much more private about. The idea of being able to share in community is totally different. And I'm wondering, because of just the nature of the Jewish psyche and the ability to maybe talk to a professional, what about somebody in a more, like an Islamic country, where it's more prohibited to disagree or criticize of the government? How do therapists, do they have much of a clientele that addresses that? Because that's more personal. They don't have a community to share with.
It's a great point, but I think when you just contrasted there very nicely, sort of personal trauma and collective trauma, and that people do process that differently. And I think, especially, there are so many sources of trauma right now, and people are going through a lot of difficulties on multiple levels. And it's if you don't have somebody to talk to about it, it can make it extremely difficult.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, what you said is really important and true. One of the chapters in our new second edition of Islamophobia was written by a psychiatrist who works in the West Bank. And I've heard her talk. I've been on a program with her, and she does talk about that the trauma is so intense that the people are coming for help. The trouble is they don't have such a strong history of providing psychiatric care, nor explanations about mental health and mental illness. So the population is a little bit on the not so knowledgeable side. But they are coming in now, and they actually need a lot of support outside of Gaza and the West Bank because there's so few mental health services available. So yeah, you have to break through sort of the oppression that the government wants to have on the citizens because they don't want to admit that there's so much mental illness and so much strong trauma going on, but it is breaking through now. But again, the interesting part, this is an aside, but the most interesting part of the first edition of Islamophobia and Psychiatry that I edited was that Islam has this tremendous history of mental health services back in the early Middle Ages, which I didn't know about and most people didn't. So they had established the first mental health psychiatric hospitals freestanding in the world, hundreds of years before Europe did. They followed principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, some Freudian stuff, great early advances. So, Islam was much more flexible at that time. And so when the Muslims were defeated then and retreated and got more fundamentalist, all that was lost. So depends, I guess, if you use the two examples of now and then, how restrictive is the government, and the leadership in Islam. It wasn't that way in the early Middle Ages.
We all know what happened October 7, 2003. And I knew what the day was going to be because my oldest grandson was his first anniversary. He and his bride were married exactly 1 year, and they were going to sleep late that morning and then meet up with friends. And of course, he got the call, what had happened, and he was in Milloween. So he just got dressed and he went to meet his group. And they did arrive that night toward Gaza. He spent months in Gaza, months, more than a year and a half in Gaza. He was taken out only for a couple of days to go up to Syria to see, on the Syrian border, they were observing something that needed reconnaissance, so they needed him there. But he has spent 2 years working on these projects, and he finally turned 39 a couple months ago. He's now out of Millowing for the last 6-8 weeks. We learned. We couldn't call there every 2 days and say, how is he? How are you? We couldn't call and ask his wife, how are you? She's new to Israel. She's only been there the 1 year. And we had to learn how to just shut our mouth and just pray that they were okay. Because Israelis know how to handle these things. You both said that. They really do. And they don't want us calling there and saying, what's going on? Is he okay? They don't want it. And when they do get home for a few hours, and they do, sometimes after 2-3 weeks, they get a few hours to go home and quickly come back to their unit. They have learned how to handle that.
It's truly remarkable. I mean, in many ways, Israel is truly such an extraordinarily remarkable society. And I think the last few years have shown, I just read recently, the Israeli stock market has doubled since October 7th, 2023. I mean, that's astounding that somehow the economy, one of our funeral director here in Chicago recently moved there. I mean, it is a remarkably strong society. Now, obviously there's a desire. So in many ways, when we think about anti-Semitism and it's rising, so in many ways things are terrible. It's like the best of times, the worst of times. In many ways, things are the worst of times. But on the other hand, if you look at sort of Israel's relative strength and potential for peace in the region, they're actually increasing. So there's perhaps not on a two-state level, but there are perhaps some other possibilities. So that's often the case in Jewish history, where the worst of times are followed by wonderful times. So I think there is some sense of hope in the long term.
Yeah. I don't have any data about this, and what you experienced has been probably repeated many times in Israel, with different soldiers and family. But I wonder how the soldiers feel if and when they hear about the criticism coming from fellow Jews, especially in the diaspora. If that gets through to them, this pro-Palestinian point of view, how does that make them feel? I wonder. I don't know. But
I think they hear much more from more Orthodox and more traditional communities. They hear the support. I mean, I'm sure if they tune into TV, they see the criticism, but they're very much, from what I've witnessed.
Yeah, I mean, that would be better, but it's, I think I'm very sad and have a lot of anguish about what's happened in Gaza, but I'm not going to be overtly pro-Palestinian. First of all, I'm not, but I think that has such negative drawbacks.
For Jews who would do that, you would say,
Yes,
what you're saying. Yeah.
yes. So I think some of our reactions, I'm trying to say, we should keep to ourselves, just like you mentioned, with your family.
I think that's an interesting issue. I mean, they're certainly on a political level, on a personal level, people are, it's different, I think. But on a political level, I think we've starting to see that in the Jewish community. I mean, Marcia can talk to it more than I, but you see that there are overt criticisms of not just over, I mean, there have been overt criticisms for a while, but truly divisive language amongst American Jewish organizations lately that I think you haven't seen it so out in the open before. And in many ways, one might say that there could be some positives to that, but it also, it can feel demoralizing to a lot of people. So it's we probably don't have time to go into that issue for a long time, because I think there's a lot of people that have had their hands up. So another session. Yeah.
I have a question or an observation. Holzer? Hi, I have a question or an observation that struck me this morning. I was watching the Talking Heads, one of the programs, and Ro Khanna was on, and he was talking about that 40 United States senators voted against supplying Israel with, I don't know if it's ammunition or if it's,
We should probably avoid a big political discussion. Yeah.
Say, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to get political, but I'm just saying that a lot of what is going on today, the anti-Semitism is with our political people.
Yeah.
They caused that between Israel and the United States.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Okay. And Marcia, you say one thing. Yeah.
Well, I'm just gonna say I was in Washington this last week.
Yeah, I'll bet that.
I was in Washington this last week, speaking to these senators that voted against sending weapons to Israel. And it was really, their biggest answer to me was, because they've been strong friends, pro-Israel, we would never not send defensive weapons, the Iron Dome, but we want this war to end. And we feel very strongly that the war needs to end.
and we're not going to exasperate it by sending more weapons to Israel. It really wasn't against Israel as far as I'm.
That's good. That's a good topic to discuss at a different day, and I think it's very important and very interesting. And it is a very, very big topic right now. I can tell you in the Jewish community, there's lots of discussion. I don't think we should do too much more politics because I know there's a couple other questions, but
I don't think
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
political. I don't know, but maybe it is. But, the whole issue of was there acute danger going on when the war started? Well, maybe anybody who's a physician here or psychologist or so forth, if you hear the beginnings of difficult mental health disorders developing or diabetes or whatever, you don't wait until it gets bad and it's too late and the person's going to die. So from my point of view, looking at it from the medical standpoint, if the acute need wasn't there, there surely was a future need for this to occur. Whether, how and when it should stop, who knows?
okay, couple other questions, yeah.
I don't know if this was a question your grandson would ask. It's a little disturbing to me that, as an American Jew, it seems to me that I likely have been trying to make a distinction between being Jewish and Israel. And I understand that, the people who criticize Israel, probably you make about 80–90% are anti-Semitic. I understand that. But to say that, when the soldiers here dissent and whatever, they should be used to this, because if an American went somewhere and they said, look what America's doing in Iran, look what America's doing in Venezuela, we would say, that's our goofy administration. Most people, I don't care about that. Most people say that's our goofy administration. And I see it's very similar to say, Israel's doing this, Israel's doing that, you're a Jew. That's a goofy administration.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when it comes to Israel and anti-Semitism, there's certainly legitimate criticism of Israel that doesn't cross into anti-Semitism. But what you just said is so. I forget who said it. Maybe it was Jonathan Sachs, but he would say that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Now, when you say anti-Zionism, that doesn't mean you're not critical of Israel. It's the idea that there shouldn't be a Jewish state. So Jonathan Sachs said, in theory, you can be an anti-Zionist and not be anti-Semitic, but it's really very, very rare in practice. And so they're really that many of the criticisms we see, not the legitimate criticisms of government, but of overall some of the, there's the test of the 3 Ds. I've talked about this before: delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. So when you delegitimize the state of Israel, when you say there shouldn't ever be a Jewish state, that crosses into anti-Semitism. When you demonize, when you say outrageous things, like there are some people on television who say Israel deliberately tries to kill Palestinian children. Okay, that's demonization. That's so far outside the bounds of that's pure anti-Semitism. And double standards, when somebody is overtly only focused on Israel. I mean, think of like a Tucker Carlson right now, where something like 80% of his episodes are about Israel. That is anti-Semitism. So when you have those 3 things, otherwise criticism is totally fine. Yeah.
It's just a quick comment. Obviously there's lots of people in Israel who aren't Jewish, right? So to forget about the Arabs who live there and other people is a problem. From the outside, I think outsiders have trouble distinguish, is Israel synonymous with all Jews or not? And I think we have an internal challenge with it, but being careful, as the rabbi said in your analysis, I think is really important.
Sue? Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to something you discussed before. I have a question regarding that. You talked about the Israeli stock market
Yeah.
being in such good shape
Incredible.
right now. Do you think that's because Jews are investing more in Israel than they had beforehand?
Oh, I think that's certainly possible. But I also think that the Israeli, again, this is getting into economic, but AI is driving the stock market right now by far. I mean, AI, the amount of money in Israel is a top leader. I mean, I forget which company just a year ago, it's a computer security company sold for like 34 billion, Google bought the biggest buyout of a security company ever. And I mean, and a lot of this it may come from greater investment, but I think a lot of it comes from the entrepreneurial mind. There's something, I think Thomas Friedman in the New York Times wrote about this. It's called the curse of oil. And now we're talking about how important oil is, but economies that become dependent on oil, like that's where most of your revenue comes from, are not dynamic economies. Whereas Israel, because there isn't oil, has to be a dynamic economy based on intellectual capital. And that's the kind of world we're living in now, is where intellectual capital is much more valuable. So that's good for the Israeli economy, which I think is a huge source. I mean, in today's world, that's a huge source of strength.
Achron, Aviv. The last. We have to wrap up, and I'm sure both Moffics will stay after if you have other questions. October 7th has been called the worst day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. What does it mean for the Jewish people to rebuild spiritually, psychologically, and communally after that kind of rupture?
Go ahead.
Final words.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Vanessa, for organizing this. It's such a joy to be with my dad, and thank you. And for so many people to come, and I learn a lot every time. And I think, the truth is, from October 7th, it's been that year was a very hard year.
It's terrible.
In my rabbinate, and it made me think back. I was ordained in 2006. And I remember a wonderful, wonderful class I taught at my first synagogue. And I think most of the people who were in it, they're no longer living, but it was a wonderful group. And we watched a couple of movies, and we would talk about anti-Semitism. And I would say, this was important. I think we watched Gentleman's Agreement once. And I said, anti-Semitism was a big part of the past, but fortunately the Jewish people are strong now. We don't really have to worry about it. Israel is strong. There was still a little bit of hope for people, and I remember that the members of the synagogue said, Rabbi, okay, we like your enthusiasm, but you don't know. It's still there. Anti-Semitism is still there. And I kind of just dismissed it. But it turns out they were absolutely right. And there is still a lot of deep hatred. And at the same time, the world's more complex. Israel's not the same country it was 20 years ago. Israel is very different politically, culturally, economically. So there's been just a lot of the old narratives of Jewish life. There was an article a couple years ago called The End of the Golden Era of American Jewry. And it talked about how post-World War II to 2020 were like the golden age. And, and that shifted. That there's, in many ways, the world, the political balance has shifted. So a lot of the challenges that I see kind of in the Jewish community, in my own rabbinate, some of the challenges are all the same. People are going to get married. There's bar mitzvahs, all that's the same. But what does it mean to have a vibrant Jewish life? I think is changing. So I think, and October 7th is kind of a defining point for that.
A couple of points on that. One of them, well, I guess the main one, my wife's heard me say this over and over for years now. This is the first time in history there's been a strong Israel and a strong Jewish diaspora. First time in history. We shouldn't blow this opportunity. And what makes this different from some of the prior wars, 1973, 1967, the United States did help in the background. They're overtly helping us now. So I view this as a potential opportunity. We need to do some soul searching, both in Israel and leadership in the United States. But I think this is a positive opportunity now for us for the future.
Thank you so much. I know that we have a lot to think about. Next week, we're gonna continue talking about Israel as people who just went on our Israel trip are gonna come back and share, and we're gonna give you different opportunities. And I think that with everything going on, we just have more and more to talk about. It's great to see you, and watch your Macomb at home. If you have any questions, see me. Bye-bye.
She's amazing.
That's the call.
Thank you. I think people like it.
Thank you.
Hey, how are you, Natalie?